Welcome to my book nook.
Welcome back to my book nook, and I'm glad you're here. We are reading The Memory Keeper's Daughter by Kim Edwards. We're still in, I believe, 1982, and let's jump in. Beyond Nora's glass-paneled door, the office hummed. Neil Sims, the personnel manager from IBM, walked through the outer doors, a flash of dark suit, polished shoes. Bree, who had paused in the reception room to collect the faxes, turned to greet him. She was wearing a yellow linen suit and dark yellow shoes. A fine gold bracelet slipped down her wrist as she reached to shake his hand. She'd gotten thin and sharp-boned beneath her elegance. Still, her laugh was light, traveling through the glass to where Nora sat with the phone in one hand, the glossy folder she had spent weeks preparing on her desk, IBM in bold black letters across the front. "Look, Sam," Nora said. "I told you not to call me, and I meant it." A cool, deep current of silence welled up against her ear. She imagined Sam at home, working by the wall of windows overlooking the lake. He was an investment analysis, and Nora had met him in the parking garage 6 months ago, in the murky concrete light near the elevator. Her keys had slipped, and he had caught them in midair, fast and fluid, his hands flashing like fish. "Yours?" he had asked with a quick, easy smile, a joke since they were the only two around. Nora, filled with a familiar rush, a kind of dark, delicious plummeting, had nodded. His fingers brushed her skin. The keys fell coldly against her palm. That night he left a message on her machine. Nora's heart had quickened, stirred at his voice. Still, when the tape ended, she'd forced herself to sit down and count up her affairs. Short-lived and long, passionate and detached, bitter and amicable over the years. 4. She had written the number down, dark, blunt streaks of graphite on the edge of the morning paper. Upstairs, water was dripping in the tub. Paul was in the family room playing the same chord over and over again on his guitar, and David was outside working in his darkroom. So much space between them, always. Nora had walked into each of her affairs with a sense of hope and new beginnings, swept up in the rush of secret meetings, of novelty and surprise. After Howard, 2 more, transitory and sweet, followed by one another, longer. Each had begun at moments when she thought the roar of silence in her house would drive her mad, when the mysterious universe of another presence, any presence, had seemed to her like solace. "Nora, please, just listen," Sam was saying now, a forceful man, something of a bully in negotiations, a person she didn't even particularly like. In the reception room, Bree turned to glance at her, inquiring, impatient. Yes, Nora gestured through the glass. She would hurry. They had courted this IBM account for almost a year. She would certainly hurry. "I just want to ask about Paul," Sam was insisting, "if you've heard anything, because I'm here for you, okay? Do you hear what I'm saying, Nora? I'm totally, absolutely here for you." "I hear you," she said, angry with herself. She didn't want Sam talking about her son. Paul had been gone for 24 hours now. A car 3 blocks down was missing too. She'd watched him leave after that strange scene on the porch, trying to remember what she'd said and what he'd overheard, pained at the confusion on his face. David had done the right thing, giving Paul his blessing, but somehow that too, the very strangeness of it, had made the moment worse. She'd watched Paul run off carrying his guitar, and she'd nearly gone after him. But her head ached, and she'd let herself think that maybe he needed some time to work this out on his own. Plus, surely he wouldn't go far. Where could he go, after all? "Nora," Sam said. "Nora, are you okay?" She closed her eyes briefly. Ordinary sunlight warmed her face, and Sam's bedroom windows were full of prisms, and on this brilliant morning light and color, the color would be shifting, alive on every surface. "It's like making love in a disco," she told him once, half complaining, half enchanted, long shafts of color moving on his arm, her own pale skin. That day, as on every day since they'd met, Nora had intended to end things. Then Sam had traced the shaft of variegated light on her thigh with his finger, and slowly she'd felt her own sharp edges begin to soften, to blur, her emotions bleeding one into another in mysterious sequence from darkest indigo to gold, reluctance transforming mysteriously to desire. Still, the pleasure never lasted past the drive home. "I'm focusing on Paul right now," she said, and then sharply she added, "Look, Sam, I've had it. Actually, I was serious the other day. Don't call me again." "You're upset." "Yes, but I mean it. Don't call me. Never again." She hung up. Her hand was trembling. She pressed it flat on her desk, and she felt Paul's disappearance like a punishment for David's long anger for her own. The car he'd stolen had been found deserted on a side street in Louisville last night, but there had been no trace of Paul. And so she and David were waiting, moving helplessly through the silent layers of their house. The girl from West Virginia was still sleeping on the pull-out sofa in the den. David never touched her, hardly ever spoke to her except to ask if she needed anything, and yet Nora sensed something between the two of them, an emotional connection, alive and positively charged, which pierced her as much, perhaps more, than any physical affair would have done. Bree knocked on the glass and opened the door a few inches. "Everything okay? Because Neil's here from IBM." "I'm fine," Nora said. "How are you doing? Are you okay?" "It's good for me to be here," Bree said brightly, firmly, "especially with everything else that's going on." Nora nodded. She had called Paul's friends, and David called the police. All night and into the morning she had paced the house in her bathrobe, drinking coffee and imagining every possible disaster. The chance to come to work to put at least part of her mind on something else had felt like sanctuary. "I'll be right there," she said. The phone started ringing again, and as she stood, and Nora let a rush of weary anger push her through the door. She would not let Sam rattle her. She would not let him ruin this meeting. She would not. Her other affairs had ended differently, swiftly or slowly, amicably or not, but none with this element of uneasiness. Never again, she thought to herself. Let this be finished, and never again. She hurried through the lobby, but Sally stopped her at the reception desk, holding out the phone. "You'd better take this, honey," she said, and Nora knew at once. She took the receiver, trembling. "They found him." David's voice was quiet. "The police just called. They found him in Louisville, shoplifting. Our son was caught stealing cheese." "He's okay then," she said, realizing a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding all this time, blood rushing back into her fingertips. Oh, she'd been half dead and hadn't known it. "Yes, he's fine, hungry apparently, and I'm on my way to get him. Do you want to come?" "Maybe I should go. I don't know, David. You might say the wrong thing." "You stay here with your girlfriend," she almost added. He sighed. "I wonder what would be the right thing to say, Nora. I'd really like to know. I'm proud of him, and I told him that. He ran away and stole a car. So what, I wonder, would be the right thing to say?" "Too little, too late," she wanted to say. "And what about your girlfriend?" But she said nothing. "Nora, he's 18. He stole a car. He has to take responsibility." "You're 51, she snapped. "So do you." There was a silence then. She imagined him standing in his office, so reassuring in his white coat, his hair alive with silver. No one seeing him would imagine the way he'd come home the other night, unshaven, his clothes torn and filthy, a pregnant girl in a shabby black coat by his side. "Look, just give me the address," she said. "I'll meet you there." "He's at the police station, Nora. Central booking. Where do you think? The zoo? But sure, hang on. I'll give you the address." As Nora was writing it down, she looked up to see Bree closing the front door behind Neil Sims. "Paul's okay?" Bree asked. Nora nodded, too moved, too relieved to speak. Hearing his name had made the news real. Paul was safe, maybe in handcuffs, but safe, alive. The office staff, however, in the reception room began to clap, and Bree crossed the room to hug her. So thin, Nora thought, tears in her eyes, her sister's shoulder blades were delicate and sharp, like wings. "I'll drive," Bree said, taking her arm. "Come on, tell me as we go." Nora let herself be led down the hall and into the elevator to the car in the garage. Bree drove through the crowded downtown streets while Nora talked, relief rushing through her like a wind. "I can't believe it," she said. "I was awake all night. I know Paul's an adult now. I know in a few months he'll be off to college, and I won't have a clue where he is at any given moment, but I couldn't stop worrying. He's still your baby. Always. It's hard letting him go, harder than I thought." They were passing the low, dull buildings of IBM, and Bree waved at them. "Hey, Neil," she said. "Be seeing you soon." "All that work," Nora sighed. "Oh, don't worry. We won't lose the account," Bree said. "I was very, very charming. And Neil's a family man. He's also, I suspect, the sort that likes a damsel in distress." "You're setting back the cause," Nora retorted, remembering Bree in the filtered light of the dining room long ago, waving pamphlets on lactation. Bree laughed. "Not at all. I've just learned to work with what I have. We'll get the account. Don't worry." Nora didn't reply. White fences flashed and blurred against the lush grass. Horses stood calmly in their fields. Tobacco barns, weathered gray, were set against one hillside, then another. Early spring, derby time soon, the red buds bursting into bloom. They crossed the Kentucky River, muddy and glinting. In a field just beyond the bridge, a single daffodil waved, a bright flash of beauty. Gone. How many times had she traveled this road, the wind in her hair, the Ohio River luring her with its promise, its swift and undulating beauty. She had given up the gin, the windswept drive. She had bought this travel business and made it grow. She had changed her life. But a realization came to her now, clearly, suddenly, like a harsh new light in the room. She had never stopped running. To San Juan and Bangkok, London and Alaska, into the arms of Howard and the others, all the way to Sam, and to this moment. "I can't lose you, Bree," she said. "I don't know how you're being so very calm about everything, because I feel like I've run into a wall." She remembered David saying the same thing yesterday, standing in the driveway, trying to explain why he had brought young Rosemary home. What had happened to him in Pittsburgh to leave him so changed? "I'm calm," Bree said, "because you're not going to lose me." "Good. I'm glad you're so sure, Bree, because I couldn't stand it." They drove in silence for a few miles. "Do you remember that ratty old blue sofa I had?" Bree asked at last. "Vaguely," Nora said, wiping her eyes. "What about it?" "A tobacco barn, another, and a long stretch of green. I always thought it was so beautiful, that sofa. Then one day, it was during a really bleak time in my life, the light was coming in the room differently, snow was outside or something, and I realized that that old sofa was utterly decrepit, only being held together by dust. I knew I had to make some changes." She glanced across the car, smiling. "So, I came to work for you." "A bleak time?" Nora repeated. "I always imagined your life was so glamorous. Next to mine, anyway. I didn't know you went through a bleak time. Bree, what happened?" "It doesn't matter. It's ancient history, but I was awake last night, too. I have the same kind of feeling. Something's changing. It's funny how things seem different suddenly. This morning I found myself staring at the light coming in the kitchen window, and it made a long rectangle on the floor. The shadows of new leaves were moving in it, making all their patterns. Such a simple thing, but it was beautiful." Nora studied Bree's profile, remembering her as she had been carefree, bold, and assured in her boldness, standing on the steps of the administration building. Where had that young girl gone? How had she become this woman, so lean and determined, so forceful and so solitary? "Oh, Bree," Nora managed at last. "It's not a death sentence, Nora." Bree was speaking crisply now, focused and determined, as if she were giving an overview of accounts receivable. "More like a wake-up call. I did some reading, and my chances really are very good, and I was thinking this morning that if there's not a support group for women like me, I'm going to start one." Nora smiled. "That sounds just like you. That's the most reassuring thing you've said yet." They drove in silence for a few minutes longer, and then Nora added, "But you didn't tell me. All those years ago, when you were unhappy, you never told me." "Right," Bree said. "I'm telling you now." Nora put her hand on Bree's knee, feeling her sister's heat, her thinness. "What can I do?" "Just go on day by day. I'm on the prayer list at church, and that helps." Nora looked at her sister, her short, stylish hair, her sharp profile, wondering how to respond. About a year ago, Bree had started attending a small Episcopalian church near her home. Nora had gone with her once, but the service, with its complex rituals of kneeling and standing, prayer and silence, had made her feel inept, an outsider. She had sat stealing glances at the others in the pews, wondering what they were feeling, what had made them get out of bed and come here to church on this beautiful Sunday morning. It was hard to see any mystery, hard to see anything but the clear light and a group of tired, hopeful, dutiful people. She's never gone back, but now she found herself suddenly fiercely grateful for whatever solace her sister had gathered, for whatever she had found in that quiet church that Nora hadn't seen. The world flashed by, grass, trees, sky, then increasingly buildings. They had entered Louisville now, and Bree was emerging into the heavy traffic on I-71, into swift lanes full of rushing cars. The parking lot of the police station was nearly full, shimmering faintly in the noon sun. They got out of the car, slammed doors echoing, and walked along a concrete sidewalk, bordered by a series of small, tired bushes, through the revolving doors and into the dim underwater light inside. Paul was on a bench on the far side of the room, hunched over, his elbows on his knees and his hands dangling loosely between them. Nora's heart caught. She walked past the desk and the officers, wading through that thick sea-green air to her son. It was hot in the room. A fan turned almost imperceptibly against the stained acoustic tiles on the ceiling. She sat down beside Paul on the bench. He hadn't bathed, his hair was thick and greasy, and beneath the stink of sweat and dirty clothes, the odor of cigarettes clung to him. Acrid, sharp smells, the smells of a man. His fingers were calloused, tough from the guitar. He had his own life now, his secret life. It humbled her suddenly to find he was so much his own person. Of her, yes, always that, but no longer hers. "I'm glad to see you," she said quietly. "I was worried, Paul. We all were." He looked at her, his eyes darkly angry and suspicious, and turned away suddenly, blinking back tears. "I stink," he said. "Yeah," Nora agreed, "you really do." He scanned the lobby, his gaze lingering on Bree, who stood at the desk, and then on the swirl and flash of the revolving doors. "So I guess I'm lucky he didn't bother to come." "David," he meant, such pain in his voice, such anger. "He's coming," Nora said, keeping her voice even. "He'll be here any minute. Bree drove me over. Flew, really." She'd only meant to make him smile, but he only nodded. "Is she okay?" "Yeah," Nora says, thinking of their conversation in the car. "She's okay." He nodded again. "Good. That's good. I'll bet Dad's pissed off." "Count on it." "Am I going to jail?" Paul's voice was very soft. She took a breath. "I don't know. I hope not, but I don't know." They sat in silence. Bree was talking to an officer, nodding, gesturing. Beyond the revolving door, turned and turned, flashlight and dark, spilling strangers inside or out, one by one, and then it was David striding across the terrazzo floor, his black shoes squeaking, his expression serious and impassive, impossible to read. Nora tensed and felt Paul tense beside her. To her astonishment, David walked straight to Paul, grabbed him in a powerful, wordless hug. "You're safe," he said. "Thank God." She drew a deep breath, grateful for this moment. An officer with a white crew cut and startling blue eyes crossed the room, a clipboard under one arm. He shook Nora's hand, David's. Then he turned to Paul. What I'd like to do is put you in the slammer," he said, conversationally. "A smart aleck boy like yourself. Don't know how many I've seen over the years. Boys thinking they're so tough. Boys who get let off again and again until eventually they hit real trouble. Then they go to jail for a long time and find out they're not tough at all. It's a shame. But it seems your neighbors think they're doing you a favor and won't press charges about the car. So since I can't lock you up, I'm releasing you in the custody of your parents." Paul nodded. His hands were trembling. He shoved them in his pockets. They all watched as the officer tore a paper off his clipboard, handed it to David, and walked slowly back to the desk. "I called the Bolins," David explained, folding the paperwork and tucking it back into his breast pocket. "They were reasonable. They could have been much worse, Paul. But don't think you won't be paying back every red cent of what it will cost to get that car repaired. And don't think your life is going to be very happy for quite a while. No friends, no social life." Paul nodded, swallowing. "I have to rehearse," he said. "I can't just drop the quartet." "No," David said. "What you can do is steal a car from our neighbors and expect life to go on as usual. What you can't do." Nora felt Paul so tense beside her and so angry. "Leave it," she found herself seeing the muscle move in David's jaw. "Leave it alone, both of you. That's enough." Fine, Paul said. Then I'm not coming home. I'd rather go to jail. Well, I can certainly arrange that, David answered, his tone dangerously cool. Go ahead, Paul said. Arrange it, because I'm a musician, and I'm good. And I'd rather sleep in the streets than give it up. Hell, I'd rather be dead. There was a moment, a heartbeat, when David didn't respond. Paul's eyes narrowed. My sister doesn't know how good she's got it, he said. Nora, who had been holding herself very still, felt the words like shards of ice. A harsh, bright, piercing grief. Before she knew what she'd done, she'd slapped Paul across the face. The stubble of his new beard was rough against her palm. He was a man, no longer a boy, and she'd hit him hard. He turned, shocked. A red mark were already rising on his cheek. Paul, David said, don't make things worse than they are. Don't say things you'll regret for the rest of your life. Nora's hand was still stinging. Her blood rushed. We'll go home, she said. We'll settle this at home. I don't know. A night in jail might do him good. I lost one child, she said, turning to him. I will not lose another. Now David looked stunned, as if she'd slapped him too. The ceiling fan clicked and the revolving door spun with rhythmic thunks. All right, David said, maybe that's right. Maybe you're right. Pay no attention to me. God knows I'm sorry for the things I've done to fail you both. David, Nora said as he turned away, but he didn't respond. She watched him walk across the room and enter the revolving door. Outside, he was visible for an instant, a middle-aged man in a dark jacket, part of the crowd, then gone. The ceiling fan clicked amid sour smells of sour flesh and French fries and cleaning fluid. I didn't mean, Paul began. Nora held up her hand. Don't. Please don't say another word. It was Bree, calm and efficient, who got them to the car. They opened the windows against Paul's stench, and Bree drove, her thin fingers steady on the wheel. Nora, brooding, paid little attention. It was nearly half an hour before she realized that they were no longer on the interstate, but were traveling more slowly on smaller roads through the vivid spring countryside. Fields, barely greening, flashed in the windows and branches with their just opening buds. Where are you going? Nora asked. On a little adventure, Bree said. You'll see. Nora didn't want to look at Bree's hands, so bony, the blue veins visible. She glanced at Paul in the rearview mirror. He sat pale and sullen, arms folded, slouching, clearly furious, clearly in pain. She'd done the wrong thing back there, lashing out at David like that, slapping Paul. She'd only made things worse. His angry eyes met hers in the mirror, and she remembered his soft, plump infant hands pressed against her cheek, his laughter trilling through the rooms. Another boy altogether, that child. Where had he gone? What kind of adventure? Paul asked. Well, actually, I'm trying to find the Abbey of Gethsemane. What for? Nora asked. Is it nearby? Bree nodded. It's supposed to be. I've always wanted to see it, and on the way here I realized just how close we were. I thought, why not? It's such a pretty day. It was pretty. The sky a clear blue, pale at the horizon, the trees vivid and alive, fluttering in the breeze. They drove along the narrow roads for another 10 minutes, and then Bree pulled over to the side of the road and started rummaging under the seat. I guess I didn't bring a map, she said, sitting up. You never bring a map, Nora replied, realizing in that moment that this had been true of Bree all her life. Yet it didn't seem to matter. She and David had started off with all sorts of maps, and look where they were now. Bree had stopped near 2 farmhouses, modest and white, the doors shut tight, no one in sight, the tobacco barns, weathered, silver, standing open on the far hills. It was planting season. Distantly, tractors crawled across the newly plowed fields, and people followed, reaching to set the bright green tobacco seedlings into the dark earth. Down the road, at the far end of the field, there was a small white church, shaded by old sycamores, bordered with a row of purple pansies. At the side of this church was a graveyard, the old stones tilting behind a wrought iron fence. It was so like the place where her daughter was buried that Nora caught her breath, remembering that long ago March day, damp grass beneath her feet, the low clouds pressing down, and David silent and distant beside her. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and the known world had shifted under their feet. Let's go to the church, she said. Someone there might know. They drove down the road, and she and Bree got out of the car by the church, feeling citified and out of place in their work clothes. The day was still, almost hot, sunlight flickering through the leaves, the grass against Bree's yellow shoes was dark green and lush. Nora put her hand on Bree's thin arm, the yellow linen both soft and crisp. "You're going to ruin those shoes," she said. Bree looked down, nodded, and slipped them off. "I'll ask at the manse," she said. "The front door's open." "Go on," Nora said. "We'll wait here." Bree stopped to pick up her shoes and then made her way through the rich green grass, something girlish and vulnerable about her pale legs, her stocking feet. Her yellow shoes were swinging from her hand. Nora remembered her suddenly running through a field behind their childhood home, laughter floating through the sunlit air. "Be well," she thought, watching. "Oh, my sister, be well." "I'm going to take a walk," she told Paul, who was still slouching in the back seat. She left him there and followed the gravel path to the cemetery. Their iron gate pushed open easily, and Nora wandered in among the stones, gray and worn. She had not been to the grave on Bentley's farm for years. She looked back at Paul. He was getting out of the car, stretching his eyes, masked by dark sunglasses. He wasn't stretching his eyes, friends. The church door was red. It swung open silently when Nora touched it. The sanctuary was dim and cool, and the stained glass windows were ablaze, jewel-like images of saints and biblical scenes, doves and fire. Nora thought of Sam's bedroom, the riot of colors there, and how tranquil this seemed in contrast. The colors stable, fixed, falling through the air. A guest book lay open, and she signed it in her fluid script, remembering the ex-nun who had taught her cursive writing. Nora lingered. Perhaps it was simply the silence that caused her to take a few steps down the empty center aisle. Silence and the sense of peace and emptiness, the way the light fell through the stained glass windows, the dusty air. Nora walked through this light, red, dark blue, gold. The pews smelled of furniture polish. She slid into one. There were blue velvet kneelers, a little dusty. She thought of Bree's old sofa, and then she had sudden memories of the women of her long-ago night circle, the women who had come to her house bearing gifts for Paul. She remembered helping them once to clean the church, how they'd polished the pews by sitting on rags and sliding across the long, smooth planks on their bottoms. "More weight this way," they'd joked. Laughter filled the sanctuary. In her grief, Nora had turned away from them and never gone back. But it occurred to her now that they had suffered too, had lost loved ones, experienced illnesses, failed themselves and others. Nora had not wanted to be one of them or to accept their comfort, and she had walked away. Remembering, her eyes filled with tears. Oh, this was silly. Her loss had happened almost 2 decades ago. Surely this grief should not be welling up, fresh as water in a spring. It was crazy. She was crying so hard. She'd run so fast, so far to avoid this moment, and yet it was still happening. A stranger slept on this pull-out sofa, dreaming a mysterious new life within her like a secret, and David shrugged and turned away. She would go home. She knew to find him gone, a suitcase packed perhaps, but nothing else taken. She wept for this knowledge and for Paul, the rage and lostness in his eyes, for her daughter, never known, for Bree's thin hands, for the multitude of ways in which their love had failed them. And they, love. Grief, it seemed, was a physical place. Nora wept, unaware of anything except a kind of release she remembered from childhood, and she sobbed until she was aching, breathless, spent. There were birds, sparrows, nesting in the open rafters, and she came back to herself. Nora became aware slowly of their soft sounds, the flutter of wings. She was kneeling with her arms resting on the back of the pews in front of her. Light still fell through the windows in angled shafts, collecting in pools on the floor. Embarrassed, she sat up and wiped the tears from her face. A few gray feathers rested on the tile steps to the altar. Looking up, Nora caught sight of a sparrow winging lightly overhead, a shadow amid the greater shadows. Over the years, so many others had sat here with their secrets and their dreams, light and dark. She wondered if their wild grief, like hers, had eased. It didn't make any sense to her that this place should have brought her such peace, but it had. When she stepped back outside, blinking into the sunlight, Paul was sitting on a stone in front of the wrought iron fence. In the distance, Bree was walking through the grass, her shoes swinging. He nodded at the scattered stones of the cemetery. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I said. I didn't mean it. I was trying to make Dad angry so I could be. Don't ever say it again, Nora told him, that your life's not worth it. Don't ever, ever let me hear that again. Don't think it either. I won't. I'm sorry, I'm crying again, friends. I won't, he said. I'm really sorry. I know you're angry, Nora said. You have a right, whatever you want, whatever life you want to live. But your father's right, too. There will be certain conditions. Break them, and you're on your own. She said all this without looking at him, and when she turned, she was shocked to see his face working, tears on his cheeks. Oh, the boy was not so far away after all. She hugged him as well as she could. He was so tall, her head only reached his chest. Look, I love you, she said into his smelly chest. I'm so glad you're back, and you really, really stink, she added, laughing, and he laughed too. She shaded her eyes, glancing across the field at Bree, closer now. It's not far, Bree called, just down the road a bit. She says we can't miss it. They got back in the car and traveled once more along the narrow road through the rolling hills. Within a few miles they began to glimpse white buildings through the cypress trees. Then suddenly the Abbey of Gethsemane stood revealed, magnificent, stark, and simple against the rolling green landscape. Bree pulled into a parking lot beneath a row of rustling trees. As they got out of the car, bells began to ring, calling the monks to prayer. They stood listening, the clear sound fading into the clearer air, cows grazing in the near distance and clouds floating idly overhead. It's beautiful, Bree said. Thomas Merton used to live here. Did you know that? He went to Tibet to meet the Dalai Lama. I love imagining that moment. I love imagining all the monks inside doing the same things day after day. Paul had taken off his sunglasses. His dark eyes were clear. He'd reached into his pocket and spread some small stones on the hood of the car. Remember these? He asked, as Nora picked one up, fingering the smooth white disc with a hole in the middle. Crinoids from sea lilies. Dad taught me about them the day I broke my arm. I took a walk while you were at the church. They're all over the place out here. I'd forgotten, Nora said slowly, but then it came back in a rush. The necklace Paul had made, and how she'd worried that he'd be caught in it and choke. The sound of bells faded in the clear air. The size of a shirt button, the fossil was lying warm in her hand. She remembered David lifting Paul and carrying him from the party, setting his broken arm. How hard David had worked to make things good for them all, to make things right, and yet somehow it had always been so difficult for all of them, as if they were swimming the shallow sea that once had covered all this land. All right, friends, we are fast forwarding to July of 1988, so basically 6 years. David Henry sat upstairs in his home office. Through the window, filmed with years of weather and faintly warped, the view of the street wavered, undulant, and slightly distorted. He watched a squirrel retrieve a nut and run up the sycamore tree, whose leaves pressed against the window. Rosemary was on her knees by the porch, her long hair swinging as she leaned to plant bulbs and annuals in the flower bed she had made. She had transformed the gardens, bringing daylilies from the gardens of friends, planting flax by the garage where it bloomed, a profusion of pale blue, like mist. Jack sat next to her, playing with the dump truck. He was a sturdy boy, 5 years old now, cheerful and good-natured, with dark brown eyes and traces of red in his blonde hair. He had a stubborn streak. On the evenings when David watched him while Rosemary went to work, Jack insisted on doing everything by himself. I'm a big boy, he announced, several times a day, proud and important. David let him take on what he wanted within the limits of safety and reason. The truth was, he loved to watch the boy. He loved to read Jack's stories, feeling his weight and warmth. He loved his head falling against his shoulder as he drifted nearly into sleep. He loved to hold his small, trusting hand when they walked down the sidewalk to the store. Wow, how moving. It pained David that his memories of Paul at this age were so sparse, so fleeting. He'd been establishing his career then, of course, busy with his clinic and his photography too, but really, it was his guilt that had kept him distant. The patterns of his life were painfully clear now. He had handed their daughter to Caroline Gill, and the secret had taken root. It had grown and blossomed in the center of his family. For years, he'd come home to watch Nora mixing drinks or tying on an apron, and he'd think how lovely she was and how he hardly knew her. He'd never been able to tell her the truth, knowing he would lose her entirely, and perhaps Paul too, if he did. So he had devoted himself to his work, and in those areas of his life he could control. He'd been very successful. But sadly, from those years of Paul's childhood, he remembered only a few moments in brief isolation with the clarity of photos. Paul, asleep on the sofa, one hand falling into the air as dark hair tousled. Paul, standing in the surf, shouting with fear and delight as the waves rushed around his knees. Paul, sitting at the little table in the playroom, coloring seriously, so absorbed in his task that he did not notice David standing in the doorway, watching. Paul, casting a line out into the quiet waters, holding still, hardly breathing, while they waited in the dust for a bite. Brief memories, almost unbearably beautiful. And then there were the years of adolescence when Paul had traveled a distance greater even than Nora's, shaking the house with his music and his anger. David tapped on the window and waved to Jack and Rosemary. He had bought this house, a duplex, in such haste, looking at it only once and then going home to pack while Nora was at work. It was an old 2-story house, split almost exactly in half, with thin partitions dividing what had been expansive rooms. Even the stairway, once wide and elegant, had been cut in half. David had taken the larger apartment and given Rosemary the keys to the other. For the last 6 years, they had lived side by side, separated by thin walls, but seeing each other every day. Rosemary had tried to pay rent from time to time, but David had refused, telling her to go back to school and get a degree. She could pay him back later. He knew that his motives weren't entirely altruistic, yet he couldn't explain, even to himself, why she mattered so much to him. "I fill up that place left by the daughter you gave away," she said once. He nodded, thinking it over, but that wasn't it either, not exactly. It was more, he suspected, that Rosemary knew his secret. He had poured his story out to her in such a rush, the first and last time he had ever told it. And she had listened without judging him. Goodness. You know, I'm going to invest in the Kleenex company and this book. The two definitely have to go together. Okay. It was, there was freedom in that. David could be completely himself with Rosemary, who had listened to what he had done without rejecting him and without telling anyone either. Strangely, over the years, Rosemary and Paul had established a friendship, grudging at first, then later a kind of earnest, ongoing argument about issues that mattered to them both. Politics and music and social justice, arguments that started over dinner during Paul's rare visits and lasted into the night. Sometimes, David suspected that this was Paul's way of keeping a distance from him, a way of being in the house without having to talk about anything deeply personal. Now and then David made overtures, but Paul always chose that moment to leave, pushing back his chair and yawning, suddenly tired. Now, Rosemary looked up, brushing a wisp of hair from her cheek with her wrist, and waved back. David saved his files and walked down the narrow hallway. On the way, he passed the door that opened into Jack's room. It was supposed to have been sealed when this house was converted to a duplex, but one evening, David had, on an impulse, tried the handle and found that it was not. Now, quietly, he pushed the door open. Rosemary had painted the walls of Jack's room light blue, the bed and the dresser, found discarded on the curb, clean white. A whole series of Scherenschnitt, intricate paper cuttings of mothers with children, of children playing beneath shady trees, delicate and full of motion, were mounted against midnight blue, framed and hung on the fall wall. Rosemary had displayed these pieces in an art show a year ago, and to her surprise, orders had begun to come in, one after another. Nights, she often sat at her kitchen table beneath a bright light, cutting one scene after another, each one different from any other. She couldn't promise people what she'd make. She refused to be tied down to any set of images because it was already there, she explained, hidden in the paper and the movements of her hands, and it could never be the same image twice. David stood listening to the sounds of the house, faint water drippings and the hum of the old refrigerator. The smell of perfume and baby powder was strong. A slip was draped off the chair in the corner. He breathed in the scent of her, of Jack, and then pulled the door firmly shut and carried on down the narrow hall. He had never told Rosemary about the unsealed door, but he had never walked through it either. It was a point of honor with him that, despite the scandal, he had never taken advantage of her, had never trespassed into her personal life. Still, he liked knowing that the door was there. There was more paperwork to do, but David went downstairs. His running shoes were on the back porch. He put them on, tying the laces tightly, and walked around to the front. Jack was standing by the trellis, pulling blossoms off the roses. David squatted down and pulled him close, feeling his soft weight, his steady breathing. Jack had been born in September, early in the evening, just as dusk began to settle. David had driven Rosemary to the hospital, and he sat with her during the first 6 hours of labor, playing chess and bringing her ice chips. Unlike Nora, Rosemary had no interest in a natural birth. As soon as she could, she had an epidural, and when the labor slowed, she had Pitocin to speed things up. David held her hand as the contractions grew strong, but when they took her to the delivery room, he stayed behind. It was too private, not his place. Still, he had been the first one after Rosemary to hold Jack, and he'd come to love the boy like his own. "You smell funny," Jack said now, pushing at David's chest. "It's my old stinky shirt," David said. "Going running?" Rosemary asked, and she sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. She was lean these days, almost bony, and he worried about the pace she kept, how hard she pushed herself at school and at her job. She wiped a fine sweat from her forehead with her wrist, leaving a streak of dirt. "I am. I can't look at those insurance files another minute." "I thought you hired someone." "I did. She'll be good, I think, but she can't start until next week." Rosemary nodded, pensive. Her pale eyelashes caught the light. She was young, just 22, but she was tough and focused, carrying herself with the assurance of a woman years older. "Class tonight?" he asked, and she nodded. "My last one, July 12th. "That's right. I'd forgotten. You've been busy." He nodded, feeling vaguely guilty, troubled by the date. July 12th. It was hard to understand how time passed so quickly. Rosemary had gone back to school after Jack was born, the same dusky January in which he had left his former practice because a man who'd been his patient for 20 years had been turned away at the door for lack of health insurance. He stared at his own practice, and he took anyone who showed up. He started his own practice and took anyone who showed up, insurance or no. He wasn't in it for the money anymore. Paul was through college, and his own debts were long since paid off. He could do as he liked these days. Like old-time doctors, he was sometimes paid in produce or yard work, or whatever anyone could afford. He imagined that he'd continue this way for another decade or so, seeing patients every day, but gradually cutting back until the parameter of his physical life was no longer than this house, this garden, the trips he would make to the grocer and the barber. Nora might still be winging around the globe like a dragonfly, but such life was not for him. He was putting down roots. They were traveling deep. "I have a chemistry final today," Rosemary said, pulling off her gloves. "And then, hooray, I'm done!" Bees hummed in the honeysuckle. "There's something else I need to tell you," she said, tugging at her shorts and sitting next to him on the warm concrete steps. "Sounds serious." She nodded. "It is. I was offered a job yesterday, a good one." "Here?" She shook her head, smiling and waving to Jack as he tried to do a cartwheel and landed sprawling on the lawn. "That's the thing. It's in Harrisburg." "Near your mother," he said, his heart sinking. He knew she'd been looking and had been hoping she'd stay nearby. But moving had always been a very real possibility. 2 years ago, after her father died quite suddenly, Rosemary had reconciled with her mother and her older sister, and they were anxious for her to come home and raise Jack nearby. "That's right. It's the perfect job for me. 4 10-hour days a week. They'll pay for me to go on to school, too. I could work on getting my physical therapy degree, but mostly I'd have more time with Jack." "And help," he said. Your mother would help and your sister. Yeah, that would be really nice. And as much as I love Kentucky, it's never really been home to me. Not really. He nodded, glad for her, not trusting himself to speak. He had sometimes imagined, theoretically, the possibility of having the house to himself, the walls that might come down, space opening up, this duplex reverting in slow stages to the elegant single-family home it had once been. But all his conjectures had been about space and air, easily put aside for the pleasures of hearing her footsteps and soft movements next door, of waking in the night to Jack's distant cry. There were tears in his eyes. He laughed. Well, he said, taking off his glasses, I guess this was bound to happen. Congratulations, of course. We'll visit, she said, and you'll visit us. That's right, he said. I'm sure we'll see a lot of each other. We will. She put her hand on his knee. Look. I know we never talk about it. I don't even know how to bring it up, really, but what it meant to me, how you helped me, I'm so grateful. I will be forever. I've been accused of trying too hard to rescue people, he said. She shook her head. In many ways, you saved my life. Well, if that's true, I'm glad. God knows I've done enough damage elsewhere, and I never could seem to do Nora much good. There was a silence between them, the distant drone of a lawnmower. You ought to tell her, Rosemary said softly. Paul, too. You really must. Jack was squatting on the walkway now, making little piles of gravel, letting stones sift and cascade from his fingers. It's not my place to say anything, I know that. But Nora ought to know about Phoebe. It isn't right that she doesn't. It isn't right what she's been had to believe all this time either. I told her the truth, that we're friends. Yeah, and we are, but how could she believe it? David shrugged. It's the truth. Not the whole truth. David, in some weird way, we're connected, you and I, because of Phoebe. Because I know that secret. And the thing is, I used to like that. Feeling special because I knew something no one else did. And it's kind of a power, isn't it? Knowing a secret. But lately, I don't like it so much, knowing this. It's not really mine to know, is it? No. David picked up a lump of dirt and crumbled it between his fingers. He thought of Caroline's letters, which he had carefully burned when he moved into this house. I suppose it's not. So you see, you will tell her. I mean, I don't know, Rosemary. I can't promise that. They sat quietly in the sun for a few minutes, watching Jack try again to turn cartwheels on the grass. He was a towhead, agile, naturally athletic, a boy who liked to run and climb. David had come back from West Virginia, set free from the grief and loss he'd locked away all those years. And when June died, he'd had no way to give voice to what he had lost. No real way to move on. It was unseemly even to speak of the dead in those days, so they had not. They had left all this grieving unfinished. Somehow going back had allowed him to settle in. He had come home to Lexington, drained, yes, but also calm and sure. After all these years, he had finally had the strength to give Nora the freedom to remake her life. When Jack was born, David set up an account for him in Rosemary's name, and one for Phoebe in Caroline's name. It was easy enough. He had always had Caroline's social security number, and he had her address too. It had taken a private investigator less than a week to find Caroline and Phoebe, living in Pittsburgh, in a tall, narrow house near the freeway. David had driven there and parked on the street, meaning to go up the steps and knock on the door. What he wanted was to tell Nora what had happened, and he couldn't do that without telling her where Phoebe was. Nora would want to see their daughter, he was so sure. So it wasn't only his own life he might change, or Nora's, or Paul's. He'd come here to tell Caroline what he was hoping to do. Was it the right thing? He didn't know. He sat in his car. It was dusk, and headlights flashed off the sycamore leaves. Phoebe had grown up here, the street so familiar she took it for granted. The sidewalk pushed up by the roots of a tree, the caution sign quivering slightly in the wind, the rush of traffic. A couple pushing a baby in a stroller walked by, and then a light went on in the living room of Caroline's house. David got out of the car and stood at the bus stop, trying to look inconspicuous, even as he gazed across the darkening lawn at the window. Inside, moving in the square of light, Caroline picked up the living room, gathering newspapers, folding up a blanket. She wore an apron. Her movements were deft and focused, and she stood and stretched, looked over her shoulder, and spoke. And then David saw her, Phoebe, his daughter. She was in the dining room setting the table. She had Paul's dark hair in her profile and his profile, and for an instant, until she turned to reach for the salt shaker, David felt as if he must be watching his son. He took a step forward, and Phoebe walked out of his line of vision and then came back with 3 plates. She was short and stocky, and her hair was thin. It held back with barrettes. She wore glasses. Even so, the resemblance was still visible to David. There was Paul's smile, his nose, Paul's expression of concentration on Phoebe's face when she put her hands on her hips and surveyed the table. Caroline came into the room and stood beside her, then put her arm around Phoebe in a quick, affectionate hug, and they both laughed. But then it was fully dark. David stood transfixed, glad there was little foot traffic. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk in the wind, and he pulled his jacket closer. He remembered how he'd felt on the night of the birth, as if he were standing outside his own life and watching himself move through it. Now he understood that he was not in control of this situation. He was excluded from it as completely as if he didn't exist. Phoebe had been invisible to him all these years, an abstraction, not a girl. Yet here she was, putting water glasses on the table. She looked up, and a man with bristly dark hair came in and said something that made Phoebe smile. Then they sat down at the table, the 3 of them, and began to eat. David went back to his car. He imagined Nora standing next to him in the darkness, watching their daughter move through her life, unaware of them. He had caused Nora pain. His deception had made her suffer in ways he had never imagined or intended, but he couldn't spare her this. He could drive away and leave the past undisturbed, and that's what he did, finally traveling all night across the flat expanse of Ohio. I don't understand, Rosemary was looking at him. Why can't you promise? It's the right thing to do. It would cause too much grief. You don't know what will happen until you do it. I can make a pretty good guess. But David, promise me you'll think about it. I'll think about it every single day. She shook her head, troubled, then smiled a small, sad smile. All right, then, there's one more thing. Yeah? Stuart and I are getting married. You're far too young to get married, he said at once, and they both laughed. I'm as old as the hills, she said. That's how I feel half the time. Well, he said, congratulations again. It's no surprise, but it's good news all the same. He thought of Stuart Wells, tall and athletic. Strapping was the word that came to mind. He was a respiratory therapist, and he'd been in love with Rosemary for years now, but she'd made him wait until she finished school. I'm glad for you, Rosemary. He's a good young man, Stuart, and he loves Jack. Does he have a job in Harrisburg? Not yet. He's looking. His contract here finishes this month. How's the job market in Harrisburg? So, but I'm not worried. Stuart's very good. Well, I'm sure he must be. You're angry. No, not at all, but your news makes me feel sad. Sad and old. She laughed. Old as the hills? Now he laughed too. Much, much older. They were silent for a moment. It all just happened, Rosemary said. Everything came together in this last week. I didn't want to mention anything about the job until I was sure, and then, once I got the job, Stuart and I decided to get married. I know it must seem sudden. I like Stuart, David said. I look forward to congratulating him, too. She smiled. Actually, I wondered if you'd give me away. He looked at her. Her pale skin, the happiness she could no longer contain, shining through her smile. I'd be honored, he said gravely. It's going to be here, very small and simple and private, in 2 weeks. You're not wasting any time. I don't need to think about it, she said. Everything feels completely right. She glanced at her watch and sighed. I better get going.
She stood up, brushing off her hands. Come on, Jack. I'll keep an eye on him if you want while you get dressed.
That would be a lifesaver, thanks.
Rosemary. Yeah? You'll send me photos now and then of Jack as he grows up. Of you both in your new place. Sure, of course. She folded her arms and kicked at the edge of the step. Thanks, he said simply, troubled again by the way he had managed to miss his own life, absorbed as he had been by his lenses and his grief. People imagined he had quit taking pictures because of the dark-haired woman in Pittsburgh and her unflattering review. He had fallen out of favor. People speculated he'd become discouraged. No one would believe he had simply ceased caring, but it was true. He hadn't picked up a camera since he went to stand by the confluence of those rivers. He had given it up, art and craft, the intricate and exhausting task of trying to transform the world into something else, to turn the body into the world and the world into the body. Sometimes he came across his photographs in textbooks or hanging on the walls of private offices or homes, and he was startled by their cold beauty, their technical precision, sometimes even by the hungry searching that their emptiness implied. You can't stop me, he said now. You can't capture light. You can't stop time, he said now. You can't capture light. You can only turn your face up and let it rain down. All the same, Rosemary, I'd like to have some pictures of you and of Jack. They'd give me a glimpse anyway. They'd give me a great pleasure. I'll send a lot, she promised, touching his shoulder. I'll inundate you. He sat on the steps while she dressed, lazy in the sun. Jack played with his truck. You should tell her. He shook his head. After he'd sat watching Caroline's house like a voyeur, he'd called a lawyer in Pittsburgh and set up those beneficiary accounts. When he died, they would skip probate. Jack and Phoebe would be taken care of, and Nora would never need to know. Rosemary came back smelling of Ivory soap, dressed in a skirt and flat shoes. She took Jack's hand and hefted a turquoise backpack on her shoulder. She looked so young, strong and slender, her damp hair, her face concentrated in a frown. She would drop Jack at the sitter's house on the way. Oh, she said, with everything else, I almost forgot. Paul called. David's heart quickened. He did? Yeah, this morning. It was the middle of the night for him. He had just come from a concert. He was in Seville. He said he'd been there for 3 weeks studying flamenco guitar with someone. I don't remember who, but he sounded famous. Was he having a good time? Yeah, it sounded like he was. He didn't leave a number. He said he'd call again. David nodded. Glad Paul was safe. Glad he'd called. Good luck on your exam, he said, standing. Thanks. As long as I pass, that's all that matters. She smiled, then waved and walked with Jack down the narrow stone path to the sidewalk. David watched her go, trying to fix this moment, the vivid backpack. Her hair swinging against her back, Jack's free hand reaching out to grab leaves and sticks and forever in his mind. It was futile, of course. He was forgetting things with every step she took. Sometimes his photographs amazed him, pictures he came across stored in old boxes or folders, moments he could not remember even when he saw them himself, laughing with people whose names he had forgotten. Paul, wearing an expression David had never seen in life. And what would he have of this moment in another year, in 5? The sun in Rosemary's hair and the dirt beneath her fingernails and the faint, clean scent of soap. And somehow that would be enough. He stood stretched and lopped off to the park. About a mile into his run, he remembered the other thing he had been nagging him all this morning, the importance of this day beyond Rosemary's test. July 12th, it was Nora's birthday. She was 46. Hard to believe. He ran, falling into an easy stride, remembering Nora on their wedding day. They'd walked outside onto the raw, late winter sun and stood on the sidewalk shaking hands with their guests. The wind caught at her veil, whipped it against his cheek. The late snow on the dogwood tree raining down like a cloud of petals. He ran, veering away from the park, heading instead for his old neighborhood. Rosemary was right. Nora should know. He'd tell her today. He'd go to their old house where Nora still lived and wait until she returned, and he'd tell her, though he could not imagine how Nora would respond. "Of course you can't," Rosemary said. "That's life, David. Would you have imagined yourself years ago living in this dumpy little duplex? Would you, in a million years, ever have imagined me?" Well, she was right. The life he had lived was not the same he had now imagined for himself. He had come to this town as a stranger, but now the streets flashing by were so familiar, not a step or an image remained unconnected to a memory. He had seen these trees planted, watched them grow. He passed houses he knew, houses where he had been for dinner or for drinks, where he'd gone on emergency calls, standing late in the night in the hallways or foyers, writing out prescriptions, calling an ambulance. Layer on layer of days and images, dense and complex and particular to him alone. Nora could walk here, or Paul, and see something quite different, but just as real. David turned down his old street. He had not been here over here in months. He was surprised to find the porch columns of his house torn down, the roof supported by pairs of 2x4s. Wrought to the porch floor, it looked like, but no workmen were in sight. The driveway was empty. Nora wasn't home. He paced across the lawn a few times to catch his breath, then walked to where the key was still hidden beneath a brick beside the rhododendron. He let himself inside and got a drink of water. The house smelled stale. He pushed open a window. Wind lifted the sheer white curtains, and then these were new, as was the tile floor in the refrigerator. He got another glass of water, and then he walked through the house, curious to see what else had changed. Small things everywhere, a new mirror in the dining room, the living room furniture reupholstered and rearranged. Upstairs, the bedrooms were the same. Paul's room a shrine to adolescent angst, with posters of obscure quartets taped to the wall, ticket stubs pinned to the bulletin board, the walls painted a hideous dark blue like a cave. He'd gone to Juilliard, and although David had given his blessing and paid half his bills, what Paul still remembered was the deep past, when David didn't believe his talent would be enough to sustain him in this world. He was always sending program flyers and reviews along with postcards from every city where he had performed, as if to say, "Here, look, I'm a success." As if Paul himself could hardly believe it. Sometimes David traveled 100 miles or more to Cincinnati or Pittsburgh or Atlanta or Memphis to slip into the back of a darkened auditorium and watch Paul perform. His head bent over the guitar, his fingers deft, the music, a language both mysterious and beautiful, would move David to tears. It was all he could do, sometimes not to stride down the dark aisles and take Paul in his arms, but of course he never did. Sometimes he had slipped away unseen. The master bedroom was perfectly arranged, unused. Nora had moved to the smaller front bedroom. Here the bedspread was wrinkled. David reached to straighten it and pulled back his hand at the last minute, as if this would be too great an intrusion. Then he went back downstairs. He didn't understand. It was late in the afternoon and Nora should be home. If she did not come home soon, he'd simply leave. There was a yellow legal pad on the desk by the phone full of cryptic notes. Call Jan before 8. Reschedule. Tim's not sure the delivery before 10. Don't forget Dumfrey and tickets. He tore this page off carefully, neatly arranging it at the center of the desk, then carried the pad back to the breakfast nook, sat down and began to write. Ooh, wow. I'm so sorry. I'm going to maybe edit this part out, me blowing my nose. Our little girl did not die. Caroline Gill took her and raised her in another city. He crossed this out. I gave away our daughter. He sighed and put the pen down. He couldn't do this. He could hardly imagine any more what his life would be without the weight of this hidden knowledge. He'd come to think of it as kind of a penance. It was self-destructive, he could see that, but that was the way things were. People smoked, they jumped out of airplanes, they drank too much and got into their cars and drove without seatbelts. For him, there was this secret. The new curtain stirred against his arm. Distantly, the tap in the downstairs bathroom dripped. Something that had been driven him crazy for years, something he'd always meant to fix. He tore the page off the legal pad into small pieces and put them in his pocket to discard later. Then he went out into the garage, rummaged around in the tools he had left until he found a wrench and a spare set of washers. Probably he had bought them one Saturday just for this reason. It took him more than an hour to fix the faucet in the bathroom. He took them apart and washed sediment from the screens, replaced the washers, tightened the fixtures. The brass was tarnished. He polished it using an old toothbrush he found stuck in a coffee can beneath the sink. It was 6 o'clock when he finished, early on a midsummer evening. Sunlight still pouring through the windows, but lower now, slanting on the floor. David stood in the bathroom for a moment, feeling deeply satisfied by the way the brass was shining, by the silence. The phone rang in the kitchen, and an unfamiliar voice came on, speaking urgently about tickets for Montreal, interrupting itself to say, "Oh, damn, that's right, I forgot you were off to Europe with Frederick." And he remembered, too. She'd told him, but he had let it slip from his mind. No, he pushed it from his mind, that she had gone to Paris on a holiday, that she had met someone, a Canadian from Quebec, someone who worked out at the boxy buildings of IBM and spoke French. Her voice had changed when she spoke of him, somehow softened, a voice he had never heard her use before. He imagined Nora holding the phone with her shoulder while she typed information into the computer, looking up to realize that it was hours past dinner. Nora striding through airport corridors, leading her groups to their buses, restaurants, hotels, adventures, all of which she had so confidently arranged. Well, at least she'd be happy about the faucets, and he was too. He'd done a careful, meticulous job. He stood in the kitchen, stretching his arms wide, as he prepared to finish his run and pick the yellow legal pad up again. "I fixed the bathroom sink," he wrote. "Happy birthday." Then he left, locking the door behind him, and ran. Well, we're going to end there today, friends. Join me for the next episode. Bring your Kleenex, because, gosh, it just doesn't stop. But I love this book. I hope you do too. See you next time.